The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only
And
mode.
I'm Steve Habeeb. I'm an architect with 40 plus years experience. I specialize in K to 12 schools. And with me is Prakash Nair and Jack Shea, if you want to introduce yourselves.
Hi, just say happy to meet everybody.
And good morning, everyone. I'm pleased to be here as well. And thank you so much at this busy time with so many pressing things you're working on. We appreciate you being here.
So we're going to learn a few things today, and hopefully you'll come away with some practical ways you can operate your school during this time, and also some long-term potential changes in the way education can work in your school and throughout the world. So if we move along to
the realities of COVID-19, today is the fifth, entering the 6th month of our nation having the first case here. And the pandemic continues to rage across the country. And unfortunately, it is not going away anytime soon. So today, what we're going to do is divide this agenda into two sections. Steve and I will talk about the logistics of reopening our schools. And then Prakash will come in on the second half to talk about using COVID-19 as an opportunity to improve schools. We're really doing a self-reflection during this period of time. So it is a great opportunity to look to how we can improve our operations. Now, the CDC recommendations have actually been a moving target. 2 months ago, this was the protocol we were looking at. Last month, we were looking at this. And now, as of last week, the update is the importance of reopening. And the political pressures are, we will reopen. The question is how and what, and it certainly depends upon where we are in the nation. It's looking at a balanced view of risk, and each of you are coming from different directions with different operations, different schools, different geographic locations, but yet these realities are the same. There is a societal pressure for us to reopen our schools because of all these variables. And we're looking at the research from science as it comes in, and we're seeing that it's different for the young learner as opposed to the adolescent and the adult. And this evidence is coming through, and you're seeing it in different research documents. We have them available as handouts for you today. So the reality of it is, and I know all of you have been assessing your own operations, how safe are schools with all of the risk factors that there are? For the most part, our operations are inside, and if you look at your proximity to others, the amount of exposure time, how are we able to get our students, our staff, and all to comply, and then the risk levels? When we look at natural activities that we do in life, and we have a handout available from the Houston Medical Association, Texas Medical Association, Houston, that ranks 37 activities that we typically do in our lives. With bars and concerts being, they've scaled them, the most dangerous, the most risky being 9, and a 1 being the least risk. So bars and concerts, we know, have been shut down, and great concerns for different parts of our country right now. But where do schools fall? Schools fall in a higher risk area. We look at in this scale, it's a 6. Some scales look and rate schools as a 7. Why is that? Well, we know our operations are predominantly inside. The proximity to others certainly is a closeness with classrooms and other physical spaces within our buildings. How long is our day? And how do we get all to comply? The youngest of learners, those with disabilities, those with perhaps a feeling of freedom or not taking it as serious as we'd like. And then, of course, there's a variety of personal risk levels with the different health conditions of our staff, our students, and all. So in returning to school, as you've looked at the operations, and I'm sure many of you are putting your plans together, you're finalizing them, you're looking at what are the options. There are 6 major categories of them. And we'll take a look at each of them a little bit. And I know for some of you, hopefully this will help you validate your decisions, to be able to look at them, to see what others are doing and what the concerns are. Now, some of you are considering a phased reopening, bringing back some students to start, and the difficulty comes, which group of students would be the ones? Or the other phase start is looking at just 1 or 2 days a week, and hopefully as the conditions of the virus improve, you'd be able to change the phasing and move along. The multi-track option is one that I know some of you have been considering. We're seeing that in different places. Tomorrow, here in Massachusetts, the Department of Education is expecting every school district to submit their plans for reopening, and they have to have 3 different options. So here we have a multi-track option where in option 1, the school is divided into 2 groups, group 1 and group 2, and you can see partial days that they're attending during the week, Monday, Wednesday, and a Thursday, Friday, with deep cleaning occurring on Fridays. And in option 2, it's actually divided into 3 groups, but they would only attend school every 3rd day, with Friday being for deep cleaning. You can see the total number of days of school per month is shortened, and it certainly has its issues to be able to evaluate its cons. A staggered schedule is another way of dividing the population. So here it could be done morning and afternoon sessions in scenario 1 or option 1. The group is split by grade levels, and in the second option, they're split alphabetically. Again, any option is certainly not ideal. Now, this bubble strategy is sometimes called the cohort strategy, where a group of students stay in the same space. They occupy as few areas as possible, and we look at the teachers actually rotating through the bubble if that is necessary, so that we have minimized the group, and certainly tracking is much easier to contain and follow within that group. Now, the spaces within our building have great uncertainty. What is it? How can we operate fully? If we look at arranging spaces with social distancing, what we had thought had great capacity for our school or for a classroom is greatly reduced, in less than half in many instances. So this is a very large room of 960 square feet, and you can see its normal capacity is reduced to 12 students. The 5th option is a cyclical lockdown. When we look at that, the students would go to school for a period. In this example, it's a week. And then the school would shut down for a period of time, 10 days, for example. Now, the advantage of that is that the pandemic or the virus itself would manifest itself during the periods of shutdown, making it much easier to contain the spread. And it's likely that that would happen, and you could interrupt this pattern so it doesn't follow. If everything goes well, you could continue, return, and then shut down, return, shut down, with hopefully, as the conditions of the virus improving, having this cycle improve with greater amounts of school time. And then the 6th option is the year-round school. This politically is a difficult thing because many traditions involve the typical academic schedule with a break. But in this case, it would schedule the population so that they are in groups, and you'd schedule them in 9-week increments and be able to break and then go into the next section. You keep repeating that pattern so that you are able to use those smaller groups using the building throughout the school year. Now, Steve is going to give you a little bit of insight as I click through a number of slides in terms of what's happening internationally and what we have learned from other schools throughout the world.
A number of countries have reopened school, and some have done it successfully, and some have had to retract and actually close some schools down. We note that in Norway and Denmark, they reopened in late spring, and they took some precautions. They limited the class size, they increased spacing, and they boosted their sanitizing. And what was observed was no significant increase in growth of the virus. So that was a very successful opening. In Israel, they reopened and allowed up to 40 students per classroom, and they consequently had to close roughly 125 schools due to outbreaks. Well, what the medical professionals have learned is that there seems to be a consensus that these three elements are important in transmission of the virus. And when we can break those, we have a tendency or a likelihood to reduce that transmission. And there are some practical ways we can do that. Of course, understanding what our current ventilation system is capable of doing and making sure that it has adequate outdoor air or adequate filtration. And if it does not have adequate outdoor air, that we may want to filter air within the classrooms. And this triangle shows a little decision tree as to how to proceed, should your system not have the adequate ventilation. Some practical ways we can deal with this. And now I know ASHRAE Standards. ASHRAE Standards, which determines how many air changes per hour should occur in a classroom. And ASHRAE Standards call for somewhere around 3 to 4 air changes per hour in a classroom. Now, if you think about that, that ends up with having somewhere between 15 and 20 minutes of that air being within the classroom. And that means that increases the exposure time. If we can figure out a way to reduce the time that the air is actually in there, increase the number of air changes per hour, then we can reduce that potential exposure. Now, a very simple way and a very inexpensive way to do that is with window fans if you don't have adequate ventilation with your own system. And for the cost of, somewhere around $500 or $600, you can install window fans and increase that air changes per hour from 3 or 4 to 15 plus in a typical classroom. Of course, that's limited because that's climate dependent. I mean, we can't do that when the temperature is 95 degrees, 90 degrees outside. We can't do that when the temperature turns very cold. So it's not a very practical long-term solution. It may work during temperate months. Something that we can consider doing is filtering the air with air filtration systems, and you can increase that, change the air within the classroom itself with air filtration systems that are portable. And for a cost of roughly $900 to $1,000, you can install 2 portable air cleaners that will give you roughly 4 to 5 air changes or cleanings per hour. Not ideal, but certainly better than not having ventilation. Remember, many of our schools built over the years were built to rely on just windows for ventilation. And then we went through an energy crisis with the ventilation systems that did exist, and that reduced the amount of outdoor air. So you really want to understand what you have, and I'd suggest that you retain a professional, retain somebody knowledgeable in commissioning of HVAC systems in order to help you through that situation. Now, we also have issues with the actual size of classrooms and the ability to house the number of students that we want to put in those. And you can see a typical classroom of 800 square feet used to have 24 desks, now really can have more in the vicinity of 7 desks successfully. Now, something else you want to be careful of, and making sure that you communicate well with your parents and with your families and with your students. And good communication, this is an example of a communication in a playbook as to how the school will go back in session. And it's good to set that up in advance so you know what to do should an outbreak occur and your families know what's likely to occur. So just communication, I can't stress enough how important communication is to keep people on board. And this really is a very complex decision that you're going to be making. And we want to rely on science. We want to rely on what medical professionals are telling us, and make sure that where we can, we put in some mitigation measures in order to reduce that risk. So I think we're shifting now to the second part of the presentation.
Okay, can everybody hear me okay?
Okay.
And you can see my full screen here?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, good. So taking a deep breath here, because now we're going to move from the logistics to the, to some of the more philosophical components about the whole reopening schools argument. I don't know how many people know this, but I think 143 countries around the world have not reopened schools. So it's probably 5 or 6 countries that have reopened fully, and some others reopened in a very partial manner. So really, the vast majority of children around the world are not in school as we speak. So this is something we need to keep in mind as the pressure mounts here in the United States to reopen schools. A lot of the material, at least as far as the architectural stuff, is contained in these 3 books. We had offered free links to the first 2. The third one, unfortunately, is published by Harvard, and I can send you the Kindle version of that. So for those of you who haven't got the links to download the books, please email me, and I'm happy to send you the links as well. A lot of the material I'm talking about today is in fact covered in these books. So the question is, what now? Where do we go from here? I guess we should start by saying we need to stop romanticizing schools and classrooms. I mean, there's a tremendous amount of angst. In fact, I heard today, I was doing a similar webinar for the World Bank, and there was a whole point about how students have lost learning as much as 20 or 30%. And my question is, what have they actually lost? They have lost some time sitting in classrooms, learning meaningless facts that they're going to have to spit out on a test. So they really haven't lost anything. And my own guess is that if you were to go 15 or 20 years from now and track back to the impact of the pandemic insofar as schooling is concerned, you will see 0 impact. But what I mean is schools really don't add the kind of value that we want them to add, simply because to a great extent they're all stuck in the same system. And we've created a system in which we have a bunch of kids sitting in classrooms. And I think that if schools have freed from that system, which unfortunately we as architects have to take a lot of responsibility for, I believe that the educators are just chomping at the bit to do something more than what we let them do. So for example, this is what our buildings allow teachers to do. So this is not something, as I said, that we should romanticize and say, we want to go back to this. Nice as a teacher might be, this is really a very, very old model that was probably obsolete 50 years ago, So school after school, country after country, this is what we see. Teachers controlling the action and students basically mostly passive, doing this that a classroom provides. And so this model is not, unfortunately, limited to say the third world countries or something. This is a prevalent model that is employed across the entire world. No matter where you look, it's the same thing. And of course, it's familiar because it's over 100 years old. I mean, I guess an argument can be made that this model began in 1875. So its time has come. We need to start thinking differently about schools and schooling. And the reason for that is because we are in the 4th industrial revolution, and this revolution is expanding exponentially, meaning that it's not moving at the linear pace that the other revolutions had moved. So the world is going to dramatically change, not in 50 years, not in 30 years, but in 5 years. Those are the kind of increments that we're looking at, and that pace is continuing to accelerate. So our children are going to graduate into a world that looks nothing like the world that we are familiar with. And yet we are educating them, as I said, looking in the rearview mirror and not looking through the windshield. You wouldn't want to drive a car looking at the rearview mirror. Basically, that's what education is. Majority of what we do, and as I said, the physical school is the most visible manifestation of that philosophy. It's always looking backward. And so what I'm saying is that we need to use this pandemic as an opportunity to think about what education can be and not what education used to be. So really, if you look at it and simplify it, there are two fundamental models of education. One is called teacher-centered learning, and the other is student-centered learning. And the teacher-centered model, unfortunately, is the one that predominates across the globe. Even at higher education, studies have shown that up to 70% of all the education that happens at institutions of higher education is teacher-directed learning. And in order for real learning to happen, all the research points to the fact that children and adults as well need to experience in order for that information and knowledge to become permanent. In other words, in order to become learning, it needs to be experienced. So yes, you can memorize something to spit it out on a test or an exam, but that's not the same thing as learning, because you won't be able to apply that in a real world context because you've never actually had to do that. So the unfortunate thing is that during the pandemic, we went from the movement that we've been having toward the student-centered model disappeared, and the vast majority of the pictures that Steve showed you was just reinforcing the teacher-centered model, because that's what the physical school allows. It just allows very limited amount of space. So the only way to guarantee the social distancing in a traditional school design is to do what all of these countries are doing, which is to space children apart and have them sit up with masks and then basically listen to a teacher giving them direction. So in order to go to student-centered learning, there are 4 key components that we have to keep in mind, none of which really works well in a typical classroom-based school. One is personalized learning. What that means is that every child is different. And so every student needs to have their own learning plan. And students are being measured against their own learning plan and not competing with other students in the class. Every student has a goal when they come into school, and that's the goal that we are trying to help them meet. Same competency-based education simply means that if students take on a particular topic of study, then we want to make sure that they have to master that before they move on to something else. So that's competency-based, as opposed to the traditional notion that students sit in class for a certain period of time, and once that time is over, they move on to the next lesson. Whether or not they learned anything, whether or not it benefited them in any way is immaterial, because the whole purpose of education is delivery as opposed to learning. So if a teacher delivers the content, then he or she feels free to move on to the next subject. And you can't blame them, because in a classroom model, that's essentially all that they can do. Now, anytime, anywhere learning is something that we are now beginning to see even more of with the pandemic. But essentially, the idea is that the learning doesn't begin or end with the 4 walls of the classroom, and it basically can happen anytime, anywhere. And student-owned learning means that students will be more engaged when they have a voice. And so what we're saying is that whatever students learn, make them partners, as opposed to doing something to them. Make it like they are there because we are here to help them achieve their goals. So a space designed according to those principles might look like this. This is a student-centered environment. It's actually a school we designed in Texas. And behind there, you see the garage doors to a hands-on work environment. So here, theory can be converted to practice very quickly. And then the direct instruction, the classroom-based models are there, but to a much, much more limited extent, and only on an as-needed basis. The real problem that the United States and various other countries had with schooling is that the minute the pandemic hit and schools closed, they huddled and came up with a model of taking their existing factory model, the hierarchical model, in which students are basically powerless, into which students are being sort of told what to do. Information is being poured into their head so they could then spit it back out on an exam. And that model was brought into the online world. Now we know from whatever little experience we have had over the last 3 or 4 months that generally speaking, this online experiment has been a failure. Some might even say disaster. It hasn't worked very well because students who might have been willing to be held hostage in a classroom, not that they had any choice, are not going to be able to do that, are not going to be willing to do that when they have the freedom to either join the Zoom meeting or not. So basically what's happened is that we haven't had the same level of participation in the online world that schools expected. And the reason is very simple, because the online world is a networked world in which people are able to access a rich variety of resources, and somehow the school is bringing its very limited offerings there and then creating a kind of a simulation of that school. And what we're saying is that didn't make any sense, because the online world is a far more powerful learning opportunity than the physical school can ever be. So what we really need as the pandemic starts to slow down, hopefully, and students start to get back to school, we want to see the school building and the school program begin to simulate what is happening in the online world. In other words, we want schools to look more like networks, as opposed to forcing the network to look more like a school. So that when the students come from the online world to the school world, they're supplementing and building upon the things that they've already been doing online. And it's just an opportunity to have that face-to-face meetings and the wisdom of the teachers, but it is not an opportunity to go back to things as usual, because especially after students have been out of school for as long as they have, they're not going to want to go back to that very, very, very centrally controlled model that schools are. So maybe this is the kind of wake-up call that we have all needed to reinvent schools in the way that they desperately needed to be reinvented. So we have a short-term problem, which is the next 12 to 18 months. During this period, we know that it's going to be almost impossible to have every child back in school. And Jack went through a number of options for how that can be done. And then we have what happens after. And this is where my focus is, that we want to be thinking futuristically, because after all, schools are still going to be around as far as we know for many, many years. And so what happens? How do we get away from returning to a model that was really broken to start with? So essentially, if you look at the short term, we're talking about what we call a blended model. And in this model, if you can see, there are a number of boxes, and the one that's in red is the physical school. So keep the physical school aside for a minute. All the other components are the things the online world allows us to do. So basically, I'm saying that you don't duplicate in the online world the school. So if you're doing anything over the internet that you are already doing before in physical school, it's the wrong thing. So think about it that way. Do not try to duplicate that experience, because you don't need to. You have all of these other opportunities. So if you just start looking at these boxes, and I'll just pick a couple of them. Personalized is very, very important, because the online world really allows every student's experience to be customized. Schools can actually do that now. And that can happen because teachers don't need to be addressing 30 students at the same time in the online world. You can give assignments, and you can have chats, and you can have WhatsApp, and you can have all kinds of ways in which teachers and students can communicate. You don't need to be sitting in a Zoom class for 60 minutes or 35 minutes with a teacher. There are a number of other expert resources from all around the world, many of which are free, and many people will volunteer to now become part of the education community and help out our teachers, so that they can now supplement their curriculum with amazing courses, whether it's certificates from Microsoft or just lessons from guitar lessons from a local outfit. So there are so many different ways in which this online world can be improved. Now, one thing I want to mention is that when I talk about the online world, I'm not talking about sitting in front of the computer all the time. I'm talking about using the online world as a starting point to doing something better. So think of an example of learning to become a gardener. Yes, you may get some YouTube videos and various other guides, but then after that, you go out and do the work in the garden. Whether it's playing the guitar, whether it's playing a game, doing some exercise, all of this, the online world just is a window to a rich world of learning far beyond anything that happens in front of a computer screen. Now, of course, as architects, we want to think about what this physical school might be when students do come back a year from now, 2 years from now, on a more full-time basis. And what I'm saying is that physical school shouldn't look or feel like the physical schools we have today. And we have time to do this in a phased manner. We call them pathfinders, do them slowly over time. And we've done this, right now we're talking about 52 countries over the last 20 years. So we know this is possible. So essentially what I'm talking about is teachers are not interior designers. So don't assume that a teacher knows how to decorate a classroom, because this is what they would end up doing. And this is not what you want students to. Would we as adults want to sit in a room like this for 5 or 6 hours a day? We wouldn't. So why would we subject students to that? So changing the design could be a huge big part of changing the curriculum and changing the pedagogy and changing the whole way in which our children learn and the kind of skills that they can develop. So here is an atelier. This is a Reggio Emilia concept, and our educators are also known as atelieristas, which means they're actually designers of space, which are conducive to the kind of learning that you want children to do. And if you look at a space like this, you can do a dozen things here that you couldn't have done in a typical classroom. So there are these 20 modalities of learning, and basically what I'm saying is that you want all 20 modalities of learning to be available to your students. And again, going back to the classroom, very few of these are available. So again, you can see that those were the first 10, and here are another 10. So learning from nature, storytelling, project-based learning, and on and on. We want to ensure that the maximum number of these modalities of learning are possible. And the way we do that is to go from the traditional cells and bells model of school design to a learning community model. Now, I just want to assure people who are from the school community that these changes are very, very modest in terms of expenditures. We're not talking about massive costs, even though these are diagrams and they might look very elaborate. They really aren't. The physical part of this change is actually quite modest, but the educational benefits are substantial and significant. So I'm going to share with you some images of spaces that we converted very often over the course of a summer from traditional cells and bells to a learning community. Here's a before picture, and here's an after picture of that same space. Here's a before picture and after, this is another school, by the way. This is a school in Florida. So this is what their spaces look like. So we converted the computer lab to look like this. This is actually an innovation lab, and as you can see, we went from teacher-directed to a student-directed model. This is a school in Spain, and these were classrooms, and we converted them to a learning community model where students basically have an opportunity to be themselves. And you can see even small touches like having smaller doors, which are student height as opposed to an adult height door, to make them feel that they belong. Again, libraries are becoming obsolete. We can change them and create something better with them that are more student-directed. Hallways like this can be converted to more usable spaces. Again, you can see here the teacher teaching smaller groups of students as opposed to teaching a class of 30. Before and after, you can see how when architecture and interior design are brought to bear, the spaces become far more functional, but also more comfortable and better places from an emotional and social standpoint as well. So again, before and after. And all of these things that I'm showing you are also applicable to the outside, which is a whole different subject. So this model applies to 3- and 4-year-olds as much as it does to older children. So you can see the befores and the afters and how different the attitude of children is and how much happier they are when they move into this kind of a model of learning. And teachers, of course, need to work together. That's a big part of this because the research shows that when teachers collaborate, student learning goes up quite exponentially. So that's part of the very, very important part of what I'm talking about, that teachers really need to have an opportunity to collaborate as well. And so if you look at spaces like this, this isn't everybody doing the same thing at the same time. And so given an opportunity, students will learn, but that learning might not look the way we expect it to look, because not all students are going to be wanting to learn in the same way or at the same time or do the same thing. This applies to high schools as well. So this is a high school space that we renovated, and you can see you'll be hard pressed to find a teacher in this space. And the idea that students cannot self-regulate is being disproven time and time again when we give them the kind of adult spaces that they really need in which to function efficiently. We have a number of tools that we to bring these models to bear. so that schools can actually measure the success of their endeavors. And so we don't want this to feel like some kind of kumbaya kind of thing. This stuff is very rigorous. There's a ton of research behind it. That's why I asked you if you're interested to read the books. These are fully researched, peer-reviewed publications. As I said, this kind of work has now extended across the United States and across the world. So this isn't an experiment by any stretch of the imagination. There's just a greater urgency now with the pandemic to do the things that we need to do. So as I said, these apps are available both on iPhone and Android platforms. For those of you who are more interested in how these apps work and how we can sort of bring the physical school building and make it a critical resource in the whole teaching and learning equation, I'm happy to provide more details on that. So as we wrap up here, I just want to say that if you look at the 4 models that we discussed, the classroom model, and if you look at the ways in which teaching and learning can happen there, you can see that there's very little that you can actually do in a physical classroom. And even those things that you can do, because of the fact that students are sitting on these uncomfortable chairs packed in like sardines, I'm taking away some points just because you can't get all the students to focus on at the same time. It's almost impossible. So you're basically getting a score of 1.5 out of these 20 modalities of learning in a classroom model. Now, if you just take that model online, you don't get that much improved benefit. Yes, students can have a little bit more elbow room, but they are going to be far more distracted. Like I just said earlier, you cannot hold them hostage. So if you deduct the 3 points there, you're back to a 2.5. So believe it or not, online learning today, even with the traditional education that's happening, is slightly better, except for kids who are desperately in need of physical school simply because they get the school lunches and they have, that's the only place where they have online access. And also these are students, some students who have mental abuse issues and other things, and they do desperately need school. So what I'm talking about doesn't include that particular demographic. Now the blended model, as you can see, goes up to 10.5 simply by changing what we do in the online world without adding a single dollar to construction. And if you do have some money to make modest changes to the buildings, you can now jack that all the way up to 19. So the question is very simple. You can't go back to the traditional classroom model until 2022 anyway, when school is fully back in session. So that's not even something we should be thinking about right now. We should never go back to that. And just taking the learning online isn't helping much. This is what we discovered over the last 5 to 6 months, because we're only going up to a 2.5, which is pathetic, right? So the blended model, which actually takes advantage of the online world, allows us to bring that all the way up to 10.5, the score, meaning that we can do a lot more under this model. And then a hybrid model where we are making some modest improvements to the school building brings that all the way up to a 19. So to me, it's a no-brainer. Why would we go back to a 1.5 on a teaching and learning scale when we as architects can help schools get it up to a 19? And if schools don't have the money, they still have the potential to be at a 10.5. So I think with that, I'm going to stop. For those of you who want more information, you can write to me, prakash@educationdesign.com, or just go to our website, educationdesign.com. I guess with that, we should probably take questions.
So we're open for questions and discussion.
And while people are formulating their questions, we want to alert you to 2 handouts that are available. If you look on your lower right side of your screen, there are 2 PDF documents there, and each of them have a bibliography of resources that you'll be able to click the active hyperlinks. Even within this webinar right now, they are active, and you'll be able to see those documents. They're very inclusive documents that are guides to help you in your individual situations to develop and evaluate and then formally execute your plans as you go forward. So please tap into those.
I'll say, look, please reach out, email one of us if there's something that we didn't answer, or if you don't have the resources. I notice it's apparently it's a challenge finding them, that handout sheet, Jack. I'm hearing from a few people.
Okay, it should be available on the lower right corner with handouts. If you're not able to get it, we'll certainly email it to you. but there is a pull down there where it says handouts with the number 2 next to it. And you should see the icon for a PDF document. But if you're not seeing that, our emails are available. Would be happy to provide that to you. And I do encourage anyone or all of you to look at those docs because they're up to date. Most of the publications were just released within the last 2 months.